No nails, no blueprints, no architects. Just hands, rough, cracked, and determined, shaping wood, earth, and straw into shelter. In the medieval world, most people did not live in castles of stone or halls of oak. They lived in huts, crooked, smoky, fragile things built from the soil they stood on. A nobleman's house might rise from quarried stone, bound by mortar and iron. But for peasants, iron was as distant as the stars. They built with what they had: trees, mud, and time. Their homes were not designed. They were grown, born from the same land that fed and buried them. Imagine the edge of a medieval village, fields stretching outward, a patch of forest nearby, smoke drifting faintly from thatched roofs. Each house looks different, tilted slightly, shaped by weather and whim. There are no identical cottages here, no uniform streets, only the quiet evidence of human hands working against the wind. Every plank bears the mark of a hatchet. Every beam was lifted by neighbors, not machines. To build a house in those times was not a project. It was a miracle of endurance. There were no nails to bind the beams together, because nails were precious, forged one at a time by blacksmiths. A handful of iron spikes could cost a month's wages, and so the poor turned to cunning instead of coin. They learned to lock wood into wood, to carve, notch, twist, and tie until the frame stood solid on its own. The first step was finding a place to build. Most peasants had no land of their own. They were tenants of their lord, granted a small patch of ground in exchange for labor and loyalty. That patch might lie near the fields or beside a muddy road. It didn't matter if it flooded or froze. The only rule was, build where you're allowed. Once the spot was chosen, the work began. The ground was leveled with spades, stones gathered from nearby ditches. There was no foundation as we know it today, only a ring of rocks or a platform of packed earth to keep the floor from drowning in rain. Then came the timber. Oak if one was lucky, ash or willow if not. Each log was felled with an axe, stripped of bark, and shaped by hand. Peasants didn't own saws. Those were tools of carpenters and guildsmen, so they split and shaved wood with wedges and knives, coaxing form from resistance. Without nails, the wood had to fit together like a puzzle. Joints were carved with simple tools, a slot cut into one beam, the mortise, a tongue carved into another, the tenon. When pressed together, they locked tight. A wooden peg was hammered through to hold them in place, the medieval world's answer to the screw. The sound of those pegs being driven echoed through the fields, a hollow, rhythmic thock, 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 the heartbeat of a new home being born. As the skeleton rose, neighbors gathered. One man could not raise a wall alone, but 10 could. Children fetched water and straw. Women mixed clay and dung for plaster. The old sat nearby, offering stories and advice. It was not just construction, it was communion. Each house built in that spirit carried the fingerprints of the entire village. When it was done, or done enough to keep out the wind, the family moved in. There was no ceremony, only exhaustion and relief. The walls were rough, the roof thin, the floor dirt. Yet to them, it was shelter, safety, dignity. A place where smoke curled upward and bread could bake on the hearth. Those homes were fragile, yes, but they breathed. They bent with storms and stood for generations, and they were a quiet defiance of poverty itself, proof that even with nothing, people could build something lasting. A castle might require gold and masons. A peasant's home required only hands and hope. In the medieval world, the forest was everything. It was the peasant's market, his hardware store, his fuel supply, and sometimes his salvation. From it came not just wood, but warmth, food, rope, medicine, and the bones of his house. To the nobility, the forest was a place of sport and dominion. To the poor, it was life itself. But that life came with danger. For though the forest gave freely, it wasn't free to take from. By law, nearly every forest in medieval Europe belonged to someone, usually a lord or the crown. The king's forests and manorial woods were guarded fiercely, not just for timber, but for game. Peasants who entered them without permission risked harsh punishments, fines, beatings, or worse. Still, necessity did not wait for permission. And so they went, at dawn, at dusk, or under moonlight, slipping quietly between trees, axes wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. They knew the woods intimately, not as hunters or poachers, but as gatherers of survival. A peasant didn't see trees. He saw tools, oak for the main beams, strong, heavy, slow to rot, hazel for weaving walls, flexible and abundant, ash for handles, willow for baskets, birch for fire. They understood each tree's temperament, which bent without breaking, which burned too fast, which split cleanly with a wedge. The forest was their unspoken teacher, and its lessons were carved into every timber of every home. When a suitable tree was found, it was felled not with precision saws, but with axes and wedges, crude, heavy tools handed down for generations. The work was brutal. A man could spend a full day bringing down one trunk and another shaping it. The bark was stripped, the ends trimmed, and the surface roughly flattened with an adze. There was no uniformity. No two beams were the same. Each one carried the marks of its making, the scars of sweat and survival. Wood from the forest was never wasted. Branches became rafters. Twigs and saplings were bundled for the wattle walls. Moss stuffed the cracks to keep out the wind. Even the bark found purpose, sometimes boiled for dye, sometimes burned to ash for soap. What the forest offered, the peasant used entirely. It was a partnership built on respect, not greed. For to take too much was to invite ruin. The land always remembered those who stole without need. The forest also gave them the means to bind their homes together. Without nails, peasants turned to nature's fasteners, vines, roots, and strips of bark. Green wood was supple enough to twist into cords before drying into iron-hard ties. Ash or hazel saplings, when cut fresh, could be bent and woven into joints. Sometimes they carved wooden pegs and hammered them through mortise joints, swelling with moisture to lock the beams tight. These were the peasants' nails, grown, not forged. But every visit to the forest carried tension. The lord's foresters patrolled, watching for wood thieves. Many villages had stories of men caught taking timber and punished as criminals, even if they were only gathering fallen branches. Yet, between the trees, peasants developed a secret system of barter and stealth. One man might fell a tree for a neighbor in return for bread or ale. Another might claim to be gathering firewood, only to return with a beam hidden beneath twigs. Hunger and cold made outlaws of honest men. Still, when the beams were finally carried home, dragged through the mud by oxen or by hand, there was triumph in every step. Those timbers were more than wood. They were victory wrested from a world that offered none. And when the forest stood silent again, the peasants whispered thanks to the land, to luck, to God, before vanishing back into their fields. The woods were dangerous, yes, but they were faithful. And from their quiet strength rose the skeletons of 1,000 unseen homes. No iron, no gold, no glory, only wood and will. Before a medieval house could shelter anyone, it needed bones, a wooden skeleton that could hold the weight of storms, thatch, and time. Without nails, this frame had to be both strong and flexible, able to sway in the wind rather than shatter beneath it. To modern eyes, It looks impossibly fragile. Crooked beams, uneven walls, yet some of these wooden bones still stand centuries later. When a peasant began to raise his home, it was the timber frame that mattered most. Each beam was carefully chosen, shaped, and joined, not by professional carpenters, but by the hands of neighbors who had learned through watching and doing. There was no measuring tape, no chalk lines. The eye and the instinct guided everything. The man who had once built a byre for his ox knew just enough to raise a wall for his children. The mortise and tenon joint, simple, silent genius, became the language of survival. One beam was carved with a rectangular hole, the other with a matching tongue. When fitted together and pinned with a wooden peg, they held fast without metal. The trick was in the precision. Too loose, and the structure would creak and collapse. Too tight, and the wood would split. In this delicate balance between strength and give, medieval builders mastered an art that modern machines can only imitate. Raising the frame was a community affair. No one could lift those beams alone. On building days, the entire village turned out. Men to haul the heavy timbers upright, women to mix the earth plaster, children to fetch water or straw. They worked in rhythm, with songs and laughter echoing through the fields. It was labor, but it was also ceremony. As the first wall rose, it wasn't just a house being built. It was a bond between neighbors, a declaration that this person, this family, belonged here. Each joint was tested by eye and by touch. Wooden pegs, soaked in water to swell and tighten, were hammered in with a steady beat. The sound traveled far. A deep, resonant thock, 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 the pulse of creation. Those pegs were living things. They expanded and contracted with the weather, shifting subtly with the seasons. The whole house breathed with them, bending, but never breaking. The walls were then braced with crossbeams, diagonal supports that gave the structure its shape. Without nails, the balance of weight was everything. Too much pressure on one corner and the frame might twist. So every angle was chosen with care, every joint placed where the forces of nature could flow through rather than against it. The builders didn't have geometry, but they had generations of memory, centuries of houses that had stood or fallen, teaching them where to place each beam. And always, there was the smell of wood. Fresh-cut oak filled the air with a sweet, earthy scent. Sawdust clung to skin and hair, mixing with sweat and smoke from nearby hearths. It was hard, filthy work, but when the last beam locked into place and the frame stood tall against the sky, the village would cheer. For in that moment, it was not just a house. It was victory over cold, over hunger, over impermanence itself. As night fell, the skeletal frame stood like a dark outline against the fading light. Simple, sturdy, alive. It looked unfinished, yet already it promised warmth and safety. Beneath its beams, children would grow, meals would be shared, and generations would pass, all under a roof built by hand, bound not with nails, but with trust. Once the frame stood, a bare skeleton of beams against the sky, it was time to give the house flesh. In the medieval world, that meant mud. To the peasant, earth was not filth. It was foundation, insulation, protection. Where the rich had stone, the poor had soil. And they turned that soil into walls that could last for centuries. The process was called wattle and daub, a method older than writing itself. It began with wattle, a lattice of thin, flexible branches, usually hazel, willow, or ash, woven between upright stakes to form a rough, basket-like wall. It was a pattern learned from the forest: weave, bend, twist, and lock. The peasants didn't think of it as engineering, but it was exactly that, a structure that could flex in the wind instead of cracking under pressure. Then came the daub, a thick, sticky mixture of whatever nature offered. Clay for strength, straw for binding, dung for resilience, and water to hold it all together. Sometimes the mix included horsehair, moss, or even crushed reeds. It wasn't pleasant to look at, and it smelled worse. But once slapped onto the wattle and left to dry, it hardened into a wall as strong as any stone for its purpose. The making of daub was a communal act of messy joy. Barefoot children trampled the ingredients in great pits of mud, laughing and shrieking as the mixture squelched between their toes. Women kneaded the clay with straw and dung, while men packed it by the handful into the gaps of the wattle, pressing, smoothing, and layering. It was laborious, dirty work, but it carried a kind of rhythm, the rhythm of necessity. The sound of slapping mud, the creak of timber, and the murmur of voices filled the air like a low, living chant. When the sun hit the drying walls, the house began to change color, from wet brown to pale gray or golden tan, depending on the soil. Sometimes, peasants added lime or chalk to the mixture, both to strengthen it and to drive away insects. The result was surprisingly beautiful. Textured walls with soft curves and shadows that caught the light like living skin. Each handprint left behind was a signature, a mark of the family and friends who had built it, and the walls breathed. Unlike stone or brick, wattle and daub allowed moisture to pass through, keeping the interior cool in summer and trapping warmth in winter. It wasn't airtight, but it was alive, expanding and contracting with the seasons, flexing as the wood beneath it swelled or shrank. In storms, the walls shuddered but rarely broke. If a section cracked, it could simply be patched with more mud. No mason, no money, no nails required. Only hands and time. Still, these walls carried a fragility that never left the people who lived within them. They knew that one hard rain, one careless fire, could undo weeks of work. And yet there was pride in their impermanence. Each wall was a promise renewed with every repair, a declaration that life, though fragile, could be rebuilt again and again. Sometimes, peasants decorated their finished walls with simple carvings or painted symbols, crosses, suns, or spirals to ward off evil. The lines were rough but meaningful, drawn from ancient folk memory, long before Christianity claimed them. Beneath every cottage, the roots of older beliefs still lingered, mixed with the clay itself. By the time the last wall dried, the skeleton of wood had become a body of earth, warm, solid, and humble. Inside, it smelled of straw and smoke, of labor and life. And though the world outside might crumble, these mud walls stood as a quiet testament that survival, in its simplest form, is art. If the frame was the skeleton and the walls were the flesh, then the roof was the soul of the medieval home. Fragile, flammable, and vital. For without it, all the labor below meant nothing. Rain would rot the beams, wind would scatter the straw, and the cold would creep into the bones of every living soul beneath. The peasants knew this, and they treated the building of a roof almost as a sacred act, a final breath to bring the house to life. Thatch was the most common roofing material, because it was everywhere. Wheat, rye, reeds, or even heather, anything that grew tall and dry could be bundled and layered to keep out the rain. For the poor, this was a gift from the fields. After harvest, they gathered what was left behind, stalks too short for bread or too rough for weaving, and turned them into shelter. To the modern eye, thatch might look flimsy, but done well, it could last 20 or even 30 years, shedding water like a bird's feathers. Thatching was an art. Each bundle had to be cut, cleaned, and dried. The stalks were then tied together into thick sheaves, called yelms, and carried to the roof. There, thatchers worked from the bottom up, laying each layer so that the ends overlapped, forcing rain to run off rather than seep in. They fastened the bundles to wooden laths with twisted hazel rods. No nails, no metal, just careful weaving and tension. The finished roof looked alive, like a creature sleeping beneath the sun. But beauty and danger walked hand in hand. Thatch was warm in winter and cool in summer, but one spark could turn it into a funeral pyre. Every villager knew the terror of fire, the smell of smoke in the night, the sound of thatch crackling like dry leaves, the rush of neighbors with buckets and rags. Fires spread fast, one roof caught, then another, then a dozen. Whole villages vanished in an evening, their ashes mixing with the same earth that had once built them. And yet, thatch remained, because it was cheap, light, and alive. Tiles and slates were the privilege of the rich or the city dwellers. Peasants could not afford to buy or transport them, so they rebuilt when the flames came. Again and again. For them, the risk of fire was a fact of life, like hunger, rain, or death itself. A finished thatched roof had its own scent, sweet and dry, like sun-warmed straw. When the wind blew across it, it whispered softly, carrying the sounds of birds nesting within the reeds. Sometimes peasants left space for sparrows and swallows on purpose, believing they brought good luck or warned of storms. The roof was not just a barrier. It was a part of the natural world, home to insects, birds, and life of all kinds. Inside, the underside of the thatch was visible between the beams. In the flicker of the hearth fire, the straw glowed gold, and thin curls of smoke wound their way upward through the rafters. For centuries, medieval houses had no chimneys, only a smoke hole cut near the peak. As the smoke drifted through the thatch, it seasoned it, darkening it and hardening it against rot. The peasants didn't plan this chemistry. They discovered it by living it. The smoke that choked their lungs also preserved their roofs. And so, the house became a paradox, fragile yet enduring, dangerous yet protective. Each roof told a story of patience, knowledge, and risk. Under its slope, life unfolded. Births, laughter, quarrels, prayers, and above it, the thatch breathed with the weather, whispering secrets between the rain and the stars. Every peasant who looked up at their roof knew the truth. It could be gone tomorrow, but tonight it kept them dry. And that was enough. Step inside a medieval peasant's home, and the first thing that greets you isn't furniture or comfort. It's smoke. Thick, sweet, choking smoke, curling from the center of the room where a small fire crackles on a stone hearth. There is no chimney to guide it, no glass window to let it escape. Instead, it drifts upward, filling every corner, seeping through the thatch, blackening beams and lungs alike. It burns the eyes but warms the soul. In the medieval cottage, smoke was both a curse and a companion. The hearth was the heart of the home. Without it, life was impossible. It cooked every meal, dried every cloth, and gave light in the endless winter darkness. A fire was never allowed to die, not even for a night. If it went out, the family might beg embers from a neighbor, carrying them back in a pot of ashes to restart the flame. Fire was sacred, in the truest sense of the word. Life itself, flickering between survival and disaster. Around the hearth, everything happened. The family ate, worked, and slept within arm's reach of the smoke. There was little space. A single room served as kitchen, bedroom, and workshop. Furniture was sparse. A rough table, a bench or two, perhaps a chest for tools or clothing. The floor was dirt, sometimes covered with rushes or straw that were replaced only a few times a year. When the rushes grew foul with waste and food scraps, they were swept out and burned, the smell of rot replaced, briefly, by that of new grass. The walls inside were rough and alive with texture. In daylight, cracks glowed faintly as wind pushed through the wattle and daub. At night, the flicker of the fire painted everything in amber light: beams, pots, the glint of an iron knife, the faces of those huddled close. The room breathed and creaked with the wind, like the inside of a living creature. It was fragile, yet deeply human. Warm where the world outside was cruel. Above, the rafters were heavy with years of soot. In that darkness, hams and herbs hung to dry, meat preserved by smoke, herbs absorbing the scent of fire. A few clay pots stood in the corner, filled with water from the well or ale brewed at home. The air was thick, but it held the comfort of labor done and warmth earned. For light, there were no candles for most peasants. Wax was precious, tallow rare. Instead, they burned rushlights, reeds dipped in animal fat, thin and smoky, giving off a weak, wavering flame. It was enough to see by, enough to patch a torn tunic or whisper a prayer before sleep. Shadows danced across the walls like memories. At night, the family slept together. Parents, children, even animals sometimes. A pig or hen kept indoors for warmth. The bed was a low frame of wood, stuffed with straw or heather, sometimes shared by 3 or 4. Privacy didn't exist. Modesty was a luxury. The day's fatigue overpowered everything else. The last to lie down would bank the fire, covering it with ash so it smoldered until dawn. A small red heartbeat in the dark. The air inside a peasant's home was heavy, thick with smoke, sweat, and life. But there was beauty in its simplicity. Every object had purpose, every sound meaning. The crack of firewood, the drip of rain on the roof, the quiet breathing of family all around, these were the rhythms of existence. To modern eyes, it was harsh, even unbearable. But to them, it was home. It was safety against the wind, warmth against the frost, a place where hunger could wait until morning. Within those smoky walls, love, laughter, and hope flickered like the fire itself. Fragile, but unstoppable. And when dawn came, light slipped through the smoke hole, turning the air gold. The first coughs and footsteps stirred, and another day began, under a roof built by hand, in a world held together by earth, wood, and willpower. A single peasant could not build a home alone, not in the medieval world. The tools were too heavy, the beams too long, and the work too endless for one pair of hands. Every house that stood in a village was, in truth, the work of many. It was a communal act, part construction, part celebration, part survival ritual. When a roof was raised, the whole village rose with it. There was no formal announcement, no blueprint pinned to a wall. The rhythm of the countryside decided everything. When the fields rested and the earth was dry, word spread quietly. A house will rise. The men came first, carrying axes, mallets, and ropes. Women followed with baskets of straw and clay. Children came too, chasing chickens and curiosity. There was laughter before labor, because everyone knew what this meant. Today they built for another, tomorrow for themselves. The raising of the frame was the great test. It was dangerous, thrilling, almost theatrical. The main beams were laid out like fallen giants, and ropes were tied to their ends. At a shouted signal, every man heaved together, the beam lifted, swaying, scraping, creaking toward the sky. There was always a moment, breath held, muscles shaking, when it seemed the whole thing might collapse. But then it settled into its notch, and the air erupted with cheers. The first wall was born. No payment passed between neighbors for such labor. Help was its own currency, repaid when another house needed raising. The system wasn't written down, but it was understood. A moral economy that bound villages tighter than any law. Refuse to help, and you refused your place in the community. Work, and you earned not only hands when you needed them, but honor, trust, and belonging. As the walls took shape, women worked nearby mixing daub and tending the children. They carried water, gathered rushes, or prepared food for the workers: bread, cheese, ale. A building day was never silent. There was shouting, joking, the dull ring of tools, and always the rhythmic thud of wooden pegs hammered into beams. The house rose inch by inch, under voices and smoke, beneath the patient sun. When the roof was finally thatched and the walls sealed, the villagers celebrated. It wasn't a grand feast, no nobles, no priests, just the builders and their families. They ate together beside the new home, sometimes offering a small toast of ale to the spirits of the land. A loaf of bread might be buried under the threshold as a blessing, or a charm carved into the lintel to keep misfortune away. These were acts of faith, not religion, the old customs that lived on in mud and timber. In those moments, a simple truth filled the air. No one in the village truly owned their house alone. Every wall was a memory of borrowed strength. Every roof beam carried the fingerprints of friends and neighbors. The village was not a collection of homes. It was one great, breathing body, each house a limb, each family a heartbeat. And when the next storm came, tearing roofs and flooding fields, they rebuilt together again, because that's what they always did. The village that built itself was never finished. It grew, collapsed, and rose once more, as eternal as the soil it stood on. Centuries have passed, yet in the quiet corners of Europe, a few of those humble homes still stand. Walls of mud, beams of oak, roofs of reed. They lean and bow with age, the thatch darkened by centuries of smoke, the timbers silvered by rain. To the untrained eye, they look ready to fall. But those who know see something else. Endurance, the quiet, stubborn genius of people who built with almost nothing and somehow made it last forever. Archaeologists studying the remnants of peasant cottages are often astonished. Beneath layers of earth, they find the ghostly patterns of wattle walls, the impressions of straw, even the fingerprints of the builders still pressed into ancient clay. These aren't grand monuments or carved cathedrals. They're stories, fossilized in mud. And each print, the curve of a thumb, the scrape of a child's hand, is a whisper from a world that refused to vanish. Modern architects, too, have begun to look backward, not with pity, but with admiration. In an age of steel and concrete, they rediscover the brilliance of wattle and daub, of timber framing, of natural ventilation that kept homes cool and dry without a single nail or pipe. What peasants built from necessity, we now study for sustainability. Their ignorance, we realize, was often wisdom in disguise. Those medieval builders understood balance, not of equations, but of life. They took only what the land could spare and returned what they didn't need. Their homes decayed naturally, feeding the soil that once held them. Nothing was wasted, nothing was permanent. Each house was part of a living cycle, born, weathered, and reborn again. In that, their architecture was not just functional, it was philosophical. And though time has stolen their names, their craft remains immortal. Some of their cottages, patched and restored, still shelter families today. The same beams, hand-hewn with axes before the Renaissance, still carry laughter, firelight, and dreams. Walk inside one of them and you can feel it, the low ceilings, the uneven floor, the scent of smoke long gone but never truly lost. You are breathing the same air as those long-vanished hands once did. It's humbling, really, to realize that greatness doesn't always rise in stone. Sometimes it crouches in mud and straw. The people who built castles left behind ruins. The people who built cottages left behind lessons. Theirs was not a legacy of power, but of persistence. They showed that comfort doesn't require wealth, that innovation is born from need, and that a house, no matter how small, becomes sacred when raised by the will to survive. So the next time you pass a crooked cottage standing alone by a hedge, its thatch sagging and walls cracked, pause. Look closely. Beneath that weathered roof lies the memory of 1,000 hands, the warmth of fires long cold, the faith of those who had nothing but the earth and each other. They built without nails. But what held their homes together was stronger than iron.